God in Darkness. Book 1. Truthseeker. Written by Stephen Eric Johnson. Read to you by Matthias Justin Johnson. Chapter 3. What almost happened that night. Flashing lights and the blare of music filled the night. If Erica's party hadn't been staged out on the edge of River Glen, on one of the many abandoned farming homesteads that surrounded the city suburb, the police would surely have been called long before Melissa reached the scene. The family was the decrepit remnant of a lost era, overgrown fields surrounding the place for miles. So far from the civilization of River Glen, its only neighbors that were getting bothered were the deer and other smaller animals that made their homes in the high grass and scrubby woodlands. The party itself was taking place inside an old barn near the middle of the property, and Melissa felt more than a little tired from all the walking she'd done, grateful she never wore shoes that she couldn't walk or run in without trouble. She knew she'd need to rub her feet down when she got back to the library, but hoped that she'd be able to make it through a night of dancing and partying without showing any discomfort. The advantage of the pain in her feet was the strength she could get from drawing on that feeling and projecting it outward. This proved almost immediately useful as Melissa reached the front of the roofless barn, where two of Paul's jock cronies were stationed to keep out anybody who wasn't cool enough to make the cut into a party thrown by Erica Fisher. One of the two muscleheads started to stand up to accost Melissa as she drew close to the front entrance of the barn, where the music and light were spilling out into the near-total darkness beyond. His companion, however, saw Melissa's look, which seemed to spark something in him, before he reached over and took his friend's arm, shaking his head as Melissa advanced. Obviously, they weren't in the mood to cause her grief tonight. The transition from quiet dark to almost ear-shattering noise and flashing, multicolored light was dizzying for just a moment, and Melissa had to pause to get her bearings. Her eyes adjusting, Melissa let her gaze shift around the room, quickly and efficiently, taking stock of the exits, she'd just come through it, the main landmarks, the dance floor, the tables with food, the chairs for those resting between dances, and, up a ladder, the privacy area for amorous couples, and the location of anybody she knew. Not a soul. This was not the sort of place Melissa knew much about. She'd only taken the measure of the place for the physical dimensions. It had nothing to do with fitting in. "Hey, Melissa," came Paul's pleasantly light baritone as he walked out of the tightly pressed mass of writhing teenage bodies before he reached out and took hold of Melissa's waist possessively. "Glad you could make it." Murmuring something about being glad to see him, Melissa let Paul's tall, commanding presence guide her through the room. The strangeness of the situation, coupled with her own uncertainty, left her feeling almost helpless, completely at the mercy of this tall, handsome, popular young man. Paul Masters had hair that was a solid midnight black, and Melissa could see it turning into a regal, premature silver as he aged. His handsome face and body made the girls at school titter whenever he passed, and gossip in the locker room when they thought the PE teacher wasn't listening. The star of the school's sport program carried himself with a confident, dominant manner that made it hard for anyone to resist him when he concentrated his attention on someone. His confidence and dominance worked especially well in his romantic endeavors. Melissa had found the rumor mills to be surprisingly silent concerning the whos and hows and whens of Paul's past conquests. The strange silence couldn't be because Paul wasn't known to be popular. It was as though everything else was fair game for gossip, except what Paul did with girls when he got them alone. This made Melissa understandably suspicious, but what did she know? Paul Masters moved in different social circles than she did, and even as quiet and careful as Melissa tried to be, there were some things that never got discussed around people of her current social strata, at least if anyone was paying attention. Since, in this case, it seemed that her classmates did indeed pay attention, Melissa made up her mind to just roll with her present opportunity. Going to this party was a step into the great unknown, But then, so was everything about this nighttime adventure. She only hoped that this public appearance with Paul would help her more than it hurt her. Most people, upon first meeting her, made the mistake of thinking that Melissa Quest was a nice person. As far as she could tell, Melissa was the only one who knew the truth. She used people. Her niceness arose more from a sense of practicality than anything else. She would spread good but not terribly memorable impressions around whenever possible, the sort of impression that made people quietly forget about her, letting Melissa fade into the background. This need to stay out of sight through the use of social camouflage was strong, almost overwhelmingly so. On face value, Melissa felt she could just write up this need as a desire to avoid being returned to the place from which she'd fled several years back. On a deeper level, however, Melissa recognized that this need was something more instinctive and more primal than she could really explain. It was a raw, animal urge, outside the range of conscious thought. It was almost as strong as her strange need to explore. That instinct for social invisibility almost overwhelmed Melissa several times as Paul led her through the barn, leaving her feeling so very exposed and vulnerable, like being dragged out into the harsh light. She hardly noticed when someone pressed a drink into her hand, a plate piled with junk food placed in the other by Paul. The drink seemed to be something sweet and carbonated, at least at first. After drinking it, Melissa felt a little more comfortable, a burning sensation in her stomach giving her a sensation of enhanced courage. Skillfully, Paul guided Melissa around, introducing her to several of his friends, including the queen of the party herself, Erica Fisher. As it turned out, Erica had been the one to give Melissa her drink, moving with that subtle grace she always exuded so that Melissa had hardly even noticed. The party was loud and brightly lit, but it lacked any substance that Melissa could feel, and with a gentle shock she realized that this wasn't her sort of place. She just wasn't getting the spirit of the event, though she did her level best to take part in the festivities, though only for sake of appearances. As the night progressed, however, after Melissa had been through one dance and started on a second drink, her head started to feel fuzzy, and then her stomach started to feel queasy. I think I need to sit down for a bit, Melissa finally said to Paul as she leaned on an old rain barrel for support. I'm not feeling so good. Hey, no problems, babe, Paul answered in that easy, confident manner of his. His arm shifted up from Melissa's waist to her shoulders. Come on, I'll get you somewhere where you can put your feet up. Feeling weaker now, her senses starting to blur at their edges, Melissa didn't have the strength of will to resist as Paul led her away from the flashing lights and loud music of the dance floor. At first, escaping the welcome relief from these raucous stimuli cleared Melissa's head. Then Melissa started to realize her present situation, and her eyes widened as she saw where she was. At the rear of the barn, in a darkened corner just beneath the barn's loft, in what had likely been a stall for an animal at some point. Now, however, it was filled with a bare mattress, and Melissa realized with sinking certainty why Paul had brought her here and why he had invited her to the party in the first place. Erica Fisher was already there, beautiful and blonde, in a designer blouse and skirt and shoes that cost more than Melissa would be worth in her entire lifetime. Seated on an old wooden chair, faded plush padding covering its weathered surfaces, the young platinum blonde woman was just lighting a cigarette. Though many people in a lower social standing would have looked at Erica in the worst possible light, simply because of her many advantages, Melissa had not, until that moment, made any kind of judgment of Erica Fisher's character one way or the other. Now, however, she made a very solid judgment on the character of the other girl. Erica Fisher was a monster. As she tumbled to the bed at Paul's gentle push, helpless now in the grip of whatever Erica had slipped into her drink, Melissa finally figured it all out. Why she hadn't gotten much of a read on Paul's character during their date. Why he'd been so eager to invite her out to the party. Why Erica Fisher, that goddess of the high school trendsetters, had been willing to even entertain the idea of having a lowly creature like Melissa sully one of her infamous parties. It was all because Melissa was intended as a virgin sacrifice, a plaything for the young monsters that now had her fully in their clutches. Paul had been deliberately playing the part of the gentleman just to get her into her present position, where he would be able to act out his darkest desires upon her, with the haughty Erica able to watch the whole thing. "Stupid slut," said Erica, as she blew smoke from her gorgeous, moist, pursed red lips. "I really don't know why Paul has these urges of his, especially with someone," and her sneer hurt Melissa like a slap to the face, "like you. But if it keeps him happy, and makes sure he doesn't try anything with me until our parents finally arrange our marriage, I suppose it's all for a good cause." The young woman's smile was cold. "After all, what good is a woman if she's a slut? No good, that's what." "Which shouldn't matter to someone like you, of course," Erica continued, leaning back in her chair, crossing her legs in a casually seductive fashion, the motions so well practiced that it looked natural. "After all, you're the sort who'll end up rutting with some pig in the streets anyway. You should be thanking me and Paul for helping to improve your bloodline a little." Though she wished she could turn away from Erica, Melissa found that the only other defining feature of the dim stall was Paul, who was already stripped down almost to his boxers. She didn't want to look at that. The feeling of helplessness coursed through her, and she fought upward, trying to battle her way through the fog that threatened to engulf her utterly. Whatever it was that Erica had slipped into her drink, however, was potent, and Melissa's consciousness felt as though it were wavering like a cloud in a high wind. Try as she might, she couldn't make her limbs obey her, couldn't even muster up the desire to force them to do so. Perhaps Erica was right. Perhaps it was better to just lie back and let this happen. It wasn't like it really mattered anyway. Not like anything she did really mattered. The darkness clung thickly around the rear of the windowless van, more thickly than was quite natural. It served well to keep the creature, for he wasn't human by any standard, concealed from Patricia's curious eyes. Audie, for his part, seemed quite content to simply look up at the ceiling, his eyes slowly getting heavier as sleep crept up on him. Solon, of course, kept his eyes on the road ahead as mile after mile of highway vanished beneath the van's tires in the still of the night. "So, what are you exactly?" Patricia finally asked, breaking the silence that felt so oppressive to her ears. "A god," said the being, half turning towards Patricia, letting her see those strangely luminous, mist-shrouded eyes staring at her from out of the pitch darkness. Its voice was strangely vibrant and powerful despite its quiet tones, each word resonating with something deep, deep inside her. "Or so some call me. Others would say I am a monster. In the end, however, they are the same thing. Now it is my turn, Patricia Ames. Who are you?" Patricia half opened her mouth to answer, but then paused for a long moment, and finally shut her mouth again. In the moment she'd been about to speak, she felt all the answers spring to her mind, even the ones she'd never shared with anyone before. It had taken only a fraction of an instant, and already she knew that this being knew everything about her. Everything that she knew about herself, at least. "How did you do that?" Patricia asked, then shook her head. "Never mind, I don't want to know. I don't believe in the gods," she added, looking back at the creature, whose head was turned away from her once more, its eyes a dim glow in the rear of the van as they remained trained on her. "I don't want to believe in them." The creature simply nodded at Patricia's words, and she got the vague impression of a shrug coming from those massive shoulders. Whatever the creature was, it was terrifyingly huge, seeming to fill up the entirety of the darkness at the rear of the van, its presence looming and larger than life. Then the eyes turned away, and Patricia felt a strange pressure lift from her mind, so light in its touch that, until it was gone, She hadn't noticed that it was there at all. "Believe or do not believe," said the being, and Patricia found that, despite herself, she was steadily growing to like the sound of its voice. It was pleasant, soothing to parts of her soul that she hadn't yet explored. "I am still real. I will not take from you what you do not offer, Patricia Ames. Your secrets and your sins and your shame are things that you have long wanted to unburden from your soul. Now you have shared them, and can start to heal." Patricia almost laughed at how simple the being made it all sound. The phrase, "confession is good for the soul," came to her mind, the words of a traveling preacher she'd known when she was a little girl, one of the last Christians left in the world, or so he and everyone she knew believed. The man had been an excellent orator, with a beautiful, clear voice that had only grown more certain and fine with his advancing years, and he had shared many strange stories with Patricia and her friends when they'd paused their games in the street to listen. Stories about the first sin that brought death into the world, and a great flood that cleaned out the wicked way back when, and about small boys beating giants, and a whole lot more besides. He'd also accepted small change from the children of the neighborhood in exchange for listening to their sins and secrets, which he promised he'd never tell to anyone except Jesus, who would forgive them. Even a few adults had made use of this service. The whole community seemed to appreciate having him around, and for some reason, when he was there, people started to get along with each other a little better. The preacher had been rounded up by the city police only a few days after he'd passed through Patricia's neighborhood. Nobody knew who'd been the one to turn him in, but nobody ever saw him again. With the preacher gone, things had quickly gone back to the way they were before, the same sense of fearful silence and lack of trust settling into everyone's hearts, just like normal. The city police never came back to question anybody, though, so the preacher must have kept his word about never telling anybody except Jesus what had been told to him. After all, the city police were pretty eager to pick up anybody they could, for even the most insignificant reasons. It was a great way to maintain control. After the preacher had been tossed into the back of the well-armored CP van, Patricia had heard her mother, still young at that time, but wise well beyond her years, a wisdom born of sorrow and oppression, say something Patricia had never forgotten. "The poor fool never learned. You don't share your sins with anybody, not even his Jesus," Mrs. Ames had said. "You share your sins, and you end up like him." Patricia knew the words were meant for her, even though her mother made a show of sweeping off the front steps of their apartment while Patricia watched the CP van pull slowly away. She'd never forgotten her mother's words, and she'd taken them to heart, storing everything away for some future date, for when she could finally share her innermost self with somebody, a date that she knew in her heart would probably never come. Now, with a momentary sickening sensation, Patricia realized that all of those secrets she'd been hoarding up over the years were out. This being, this thing, since she didn't know what else to call it, knew them all, just like that. It had been so easy. And it was saying that she'd wanted to share them? All those things that, if anybody knew, would make her lose her family, her friends, and probably her life? The feeling passed, though, much faster than Patricia had thought it would. In its place, instead of the cold sickness of despair, she felt a soothing warmth, a sensation that she was safe, and that everything was going to get better now. "Things aren't that simple," Patricia told the being, pushing the feeling back, not daring to trust either the feeling or the thing in the darkness. "No," the being replied, "they are not." Then his luminous eyes shifted, his head jerking slightly. "She is in danger," said the being, his eyes starting to glow more brightly, revealing a few of his strange, inhuman features to Patricia's view in the darkness, but only just a few. "I must save her." "Who's in danger?" asked Patricia, and even Adi moved his head to look at the being, his normally relaxed expression showing a brief flash of concern. "You will meet her," said the being, his voice slightly strained as his whole body tensed, all of his focus on something that Patricia and Audie could not see, but which they could sense was very real. "Later. Now, however, I need to concentrate." Sensing that the time for talking had passed, Patricia let the silence settle once more into the van. Turning her head, looking past Audie, who had closed his eyes and seemed to be trying to get some sleep, she stared out at the road through the front windshield. "Little Miss Ames," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. "What have you gotten yourself into this time?" Sometimes Sheriff Maxwell Malone wished he wasn't such a sucker for redheads. He'd ended up saddled with one of the most cantankerous wives he could imagine, just because he simply couldn't resist the way she looked, the way she talked, everything about her. For as long as Maggie had lived, Maxwell Malone had been utterly devoted to her, willing to do anything she wanted, almost her slave. But Maggie Malone had died in childbirth, and Maxwell had been left with a baby girl he had no idea how to raise. So he did the best he could under the circumstances, and hoped it would all turn out for the best. As it happened, Casey, his daughter, turned out to be almost the spitting image of her mother, with the same mane of ginger hair, the same green eyes, and, as the sheriff of River Glen quickly discovered, the same knack for getting Maxwell Malone to do just about anything she wanted. In this case, Casey had really lucked out, as had her father, because all she wanted was something he'd been thinking about doing anyway. Through his sources, which were many and varied and kept Maxwell much better informed than most people would believe of a small-town sheriff, he had gotten wind of a party planned for that night. Just some rich kid playtime, he figured, nothing too serious, but also probably not something their parents would want them to do. There was a curfew around River Glen, and there were also laws about alcohol consumption by minors. Many similar communities had let these laws slide over the years, but River Glen had kept them firmly instituted in a bout of self-righteous public high spirits when it had come to a vote shortly after Sheriff Malone had taken his position. That was all it took for Sheriff Malone to break the whole thing up, and maybe save a few kids from ending up saddled with babies they weren't ready to take care of yet. Casey Malone wanting her dad to check up on a friend of hers who was going to be there, someone named Melissa Quest, was a side note to the rest of the night. River Glen had more police than most of the townships in the area, simply because it was such a hub of trade, thanks to the nearness of both river and railway. Sheriff Malone could probably have had 2 or 3 other cruisers with him as backup, but he hadn't really felt the need. After all, it was just a bunch of teenagers, and he didn't mind giving them the chance to scatter when he showed up. Sure, he'd probably make 1 or 2 token arrests, but that wasn't the point, not when there was a strong likelihood of the children of the highest-ranking citizens of River Glen being present. No, the point was to keep those kids safe from themselves, not make arrests, and that just meant breaking up the party, which Sheriff Malone knew he could do on his own. After a little drive out of the town proper, Sheriff Malone smirked. The light from the old barn made his destination pretty obvious, and he'd heard the party long before he saw it, with the loud music that kids these days seem to find so attractive blasting like the baying of bloodhounds. Keeping the lights and siren of his cruiser off for the time being, Sheriff Malone let himself idle quietly up the dirt road leading to the barn. "Nice and close," he whispered to himself, "for maximum effect." Melissa felt disgust pulse through her body as she felt Paul's hands groping her through her clothes. He was naked now, and almost on top of her as he took his time, drew it out. It was pretty obvious that the dark-haired youth with those pouting lips and bad boy good looks had done this many, many times before. The thought sent cold shudders through Melissa's body as she was confronted with the face of evil. Paul was smart as well as handsome, and he knew all the right things to say and do to get a girl to do whatever he wanted. He didn't need to rape anybody, that much was certain. No, He wasn't doing this because he had to. This cruel young man did what he was doing just as he'd done it before because he enjoyed it. Look at Erica or look at Paul. Neither option was appealing, so Melissa used what little control of her body she had left to look up at the ceiling instead. Erica was cut from the same cloth as Paul, of course, rich, popular, and blessed with brains as well as good looks. Erica had everything handed to her on a silver platter, just like Paul. There was nothing that she or he would ever lack for in their lives, just as long as they didn't do anything too terribly foolish with their parents' money. Freed from the concerns of simple survival, Erica had so much opportunity that she hardly knew what to do with it. What she chose to do with that freedom and those natural advantages, however, was to amuse herself by preying on others. Paul was just another tool in her arsenal of injury, a beast she would occasionally feed to keep him under her control. It was the sheer enormity of the combined evil of these two young people, hardly older than she was herself, that finally broke through the drug-induced haze into which Melissa had fallen. They had so much opportunity, so much possibility, so many chances to help others, to make something of themselves, to become something great, but instead of taking those opportunities, they chose instead to squander them in self-indulgence. Simple hedonism wasn't enough for them, though. They also felt the need to use what they had to actively hurt others, to make the entire world worse for their having been in it. This could not stand. Melissa was not the sort of person who anybody would call violent by nature. Though her friend, Casey, might have a fiery temper, Melissa was always the mediator in her little circle, the diplomat, the one to soothe things over in social situations, to make people feel good about themselves and about others, and become more willing to be friendly. Those who knew her would say that Melissa didn't have a violent bone in her body. Those who knew her would be wrong. The feeling that welled up inside of Melissa as she considered Paul and Erica was something she'd felt only a few times before. It was her sense of justice, of raw, unbridled, righteous indignation. What they had done in the past, just as what they were doing now, wasn't just a matter of self-preservation for Melissa. No, this act as they were committing on her was part of something much larger, much more vile, and Melissa could not accept it. She wouldn't. Many times in the past, Melissa had lacked the courage, felt she'd lacked the strength, to do what was right regardless of the consequences. She'd wanted to fit in, to be a part of the group, to not make waves, and doing what was right sometimes made this desire impossible. Now, though, she felt her body suddenly become her own once more, her limbs filling with incredible strength, more than she'd ever thought she had. Paul was just lifting her legs, reaching for the waist of her pants, when the surge of power washed over Melissa, filling her with confidence as well as physical ability. Her body tensing up, Melissa tucked her legs back to her chest, her hands tightly gripping the mattress beneath her for support. Erica was still watching the proceedings with an air of worldly boredom and didn't realize the danger to her boyfriend. Paul was too focused on trying to grab Melissa's pants and get them off to realize his own danger for several vital moments. These moments were all it took for Melissa to lift her head, sighting down her legs at Paul's midsection for just a moment, and then to thrust her feet forward with all her might. As the dark-haired young man had lifted himself up on his knees to better grab at Melissa, her outthrust feet impacted squarely with his groin. All her weight was behind the double-legged kick, and its force was enough to send Paul flying backwards off the bed and tumbling to the ground. He was in too much shock at first to even realize what had happened, but as he started to move, his thoughts coming back to him, the full weight of injury also hit him with explosive force. He doubled over, grabbing at his groin, tears starting to stream down his cheeks from pain more intense than anything he'd ever experienced before. His whole world narrowed down to points of intense white heat. Erica's head turned to stare in open-mouthed shock at her boyfriend as he crumpled onto his side on the floor and curled into a fetal position. This was fortunate, Melissa thought, since it meant that she, Melissa, didn't have to be so ashamed as she turned her head to one side and voided the contents of her stomach onto the floor of the barn, including the poison which had been put in her drink. A beat passed as Melissa sat up, wiping her mouth, her head much clearer now. Then Erica's head turned back towards the other girl, her eyes blazing with raw fury. "I'll kill you for that!" The blonde-haired, blue-eyed teen queen spat like a bat out of hell as she rose from her chair, hands lifting, fingers extended as she prepared to start tearing into Melissa like some feral cat. Still dazed, too much of the stuff in her drink still in her bloodstream for her to react fast enough to have much hope of fighting off Erica, Melissa lifted her hands in readiness to ward off what she could of the imminent attack. At that moment, however, the music blaring from the front of the barn was drowned out by the blare of a siren. It was the police. Erica's head snapped toward the entry, assessing the situation in an instant, her eyes sharp with comprehension. She gave Melissa one final, terrible glare, enough to send a chill down Melissa's spine. Seeing that glare, Melissa knew that her life was about to become a living hell, before Erica turned and thrust her arms under Paul's shoulders, demonstrating a surprising amount of strength, enough to haul him up to a sitting position. "Get up, you idiot!" she snarled at the still curled-up young man. "Get up and get your pants on! The cops are here!" She glared out towards the front of the barn, where the massed adolescent crowd was milling around in a panic, screaming and dropping things as they fled any way that led out. Through windows, out the front doors, and a few even tore out boards near the back and used the hole they made as an exit. Cursing and berating him with her words while slapping and scratching him with her hands, Erica eventually got Paul up, then got him into his boxers. He wasn't able to put on his pants, though. He hurt too much to have any pressure on his abused genitalia. The thought that her boyfriend might have been rendered sterile, infuriating Erica all the more. She wheeled around, looking for Melissa, determined to at least get some swift vengeance now, before she started the plotting that would ensure Melissa's social life would die in bloody homicide. Melissa, however, had used the time of Erica's distraction to best effect, and was already in the middle of the now cleared dance floor, unsteady on her feet, but right in the middle of the police cruiser's headlights. There wouldn't be any way to get to her now without being seen, Erica realized, and so, thwarted, she began to feverishly bully Paul out the rear door of the barn, where nobody, it seemed, had thought to go in their frantic dash to escape. "You'll get yours, Melissa Quest," Erica hissed into the darkness, her sharp nails digging into Paul's arm as she almost dragged him along, his legs only barely functional. Sheriff Malone couldn't help but smile to himself as he watched the kids in the barn scatter like chickens set upon by a cat. Since it wasn't really his intent to make too many arrests, he took his time moving from his seat, giving them plenty of time to clear out. He figured the only ones that would be left within easy arresting range, after the shock he'd just given them, would be the ones that probably needed some medical attention anyway, or were just too dumb to be allowed to walk the streets. Casually pushing open the door to the cruiser after several minutes had passed and the majority of the hubbub had died down, Malone turned off his siren and got out before he began to walk casually towards the barn, staying out of the glare of his own headlights to keep from blinding himself too badly. "All right," he said, with an almost jovial air as he stepped into the brightly lit interior of the barn. "Nobody Whatever else Sheriff Malone was about to say was quite abruptly cut off as a young woman, it was Melissa Quest, dropped forward, colliding heavily with his barrel chest. She was just sliding down to the floor when his arms encircled her, holding her up. "Melissa?" Malone asked, looking down at the girl. Melissa looked up at him lazily, moving her lips, but no sound coming out. "Melissa!" One broad arm wrapping around Melissa, keeping her up, pressing her against his chest, Malone used his other hand to lift Melissa's eyelids, looking down at her clearly dilated pupils. "Mr. Malone," Melissa suddenly said with startling clarity, blinking as he took his hand away from her eyes, and then trying, without quite succeeding, to stand on her own. "Mr. Malone, you have no idea how glad I am to see you." "That's Sheriff Malone right now, Melissa," said Malone with a smirk, carefully guiding Melissa back towards the cruiser, her footsteps so very unsteady. "I'm on duty, after all." "It was just a soda pop, Sheriff Malone," said Melissa tiredly, slumping into the rear seat as Malone pulled the door open for her and then buckled her in himself after she tried once, and found she didn't have the strength or coordination. "It was just... Her words slurring off, Melissa's head slumped forward, though her eyes remained partially open. Sheriff Malone frowned and hurried around to the driver's side, getting in and getting himself back in gear. "I'm going to take you down to the town hospital, Melissa," said the sheriff as he glanced back at Melissa in the rear-view mirror. "It's pretty obvious you've been drugged with something. You're going to need some help to make sure you don't get overdosed from whatever it was you drank." "Thanks, Sheriff Malone," said Melissa, her eyes falling closed for a moment, before she forced them open again with an effort. "Should I stay awake? I heard you're supposed to try to stay awake." "Try, Melissa," said Malone with a gentle, worried smile, as he turned his siren back on and started to speed up as fast as he dared. "Keep talking to me if it helps. What were you doing out there, anyway?" "It was just a party, Sheriff Malone," said Melissa, obviously working very hard to pronounce his full title properly, clinging to it like a life-preserver. "Just trying to be liked, that's all. Should have listened to Casey. Thought she was just jealous." Melissa paused for a moment, looking down, her face anguished. "She's a really good friend, Sheriff Malone. Your daughter's maybe the best friend I've ever had. She sent you. That means that she saved my life, I think." She half raised her eyes, looking into Malone's via the rear-view mirror. "Thank her for me, Sheriff Malone. And thank you, too." Melissa did manage to keep talking all the way to the medical center River Glen maintained for emergencies. It was called a hospital, but it was only a single-story building with just enough beds for the nightly skeleton crew to handle. Behind the medical center were the remnants of what had once been the town's hospital, back when it had been a city, but there wasn't anything there now except a few bare girders sticking up from the ground, and the bare cement of the old hospital's foundations. Being sheriff had its benefits, of course, and one of them was being able to make sure that Melissa got one of those beds in the medical center. Sheriff Malone stepped outside while the nurse gave Melissa a dose of something that would, supposedly, flush the poison she'd taken out of her system. The nurse told the sheriff in passing that Melissa was lucky, since she'd thrown up earlier in the night. It meant that most of the drugs she'd been slipped hadn't gotten into her bloodstream, and she might even be able to get around later that night. Then Malone's attention was distracted as another case suddenly crowded into the hospital. He recognized the patient as well as his companion immediately. Paul Masters and Erica Fisher, kids of some of the wealthiest and most influential people in a town of the wealthy and influential. Hanging back, just being inconspicuous for the time being, Malone quietly overheard the nurse on duty saying something about blunt force trauma to the testicles, about the rupturing of the septum, and a host of other very grisly-sounding words that seemed to indicate that Paul Masters was in for a lot of unpleasantness. Malone's assessment was proven true when the nurse made a call into the city, requesting a helijet pickup for the injured party. Perhaps if it had been somebody else, Sheriff Maxwell Malone would have felt a degree of pity for the poor guy. It was Paul Masters, though, and the sheriff couldn't find it in him to feel anything but a sense of smug satisfaction. As Malone's daddy had often said in such cases, it couldn't happen to a nicer guy. There was, however, one little problem that arose in the midst of all this noise and confusion. While the nurses had been prepping Paul Masters for transport, and Sheriff Malone had been eavesdropping on the events thereof, Melissa Quest quietly disappeared.